Welcome to the second of these Beijing 25 webinars. I'm still a little surprised that we've managed to organize these, I'll tell you very honestly. And so from that place of delight and surprise, I want to welcome all of you, especially the panelists, Dr. Ruth Manorama, Suneeta Dhar, and Sanya Seth. And not just for being a part of this panel, but also for their enthusiastic support as I was putting it together, sort of flailing about in the dark and figuring out, well, what to do, how to do, where to go. So thank you so much for your support and encouragement through this. Prajnya has not really ventured into doing anything around international relations issues so far. I mean, we do a lot of gender and militarization workshops and so on as part of our various campaigns, but we haven't really entered this zone yet. And so this is all very new for us and very exciting for me personally, because it's closer to what I trained to do than anything I actually do every day. So on that note, I want to tell you a little bit about why we picked the theme of this. This came out of conversations actually also with Sanya. We were talking, we've been doing things through the lockdown on the impact of COVID and lessons from other disasters for this pandemic and what we could do and so on. And we wanted to take a little time to reflect on how COVID alters the way in which we assess our progress along the Beijing Platform for Action. So having said this, let me introduce the panelists today. And I'm going to treat myself to reading out their bios. After many years of just winging it and people saying, oh, don't bother, and everybody knows, I think it's just really nice to read these out formally now, because it's a way in which we give particularly women space and we let them take space. So Dr. Ruth Manorama, a feminist activist involved in educating, organizing and mobilizing women, Dalits, urban poor and unorganized sector over 3 decades from the grassroots to national levels in India. She holds key positions in several women's groups like the National Alliance of Women, NAWO, the National Federation of Dalit Women, NFDW, both of which she helped found in 1995, the National Center for Labor, a confederation of unorganized sector unions and human rights organizations in the country and outside. She has built wider networks with women's organizations, trade unions, and various social movements in the country. She sees the interconnectedness between these issues and the common cause of the marginalized people shared the world over. She has participated as a delegate as well as a resource person in several Asian, global, and United Nations conferences from 1979 onwards on issues pertaining to women, health, peace, labor, indigenous peoples, racism, and Dalit environmental and human rights. And because they wrote these bios themselves, they are really very modest. And I suspect there are many things they are not telling us. Suneeta Dhar has over 4 decades of work on advancing women's human rights and gender justice. She works across women's groups, community collectives, national and international agencies. Her work has centered around designing multi-stakeholder programs, including on ending violence against women and building safer cities, and integrating gender within large-scale on-ground rural programs. She has earlier worked with UNIFEM at their Delhi and New York offices. She is a co-founder and chair of South Asia Women's Foundation, India, a women's fund. She has earlier served on expert committees of NCW 2017-2019 and the Supreme Court on widows' rehabilitation in 2017. She has facilitated several trainings, including for programs of the National Gender Center, LBS-NAA Mussoorie. She is a member of the Civil Society Advisory Group and National Beijing +25 Group of UN Women India, a core member a core group member of Sangat and co-founder Feminist Policy Collective. She's associated with Jaguari as senior advisor. Suneeta has a master's degree from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. She has been recipient of the Fulbright and Advocacy Institute fellowships in 1982 and 1996, respectively, for development practitioners. She has written several training manuals, papers for national international journals, and publications on women's safety, access to basic services, governance, gender and SDGs, and the new urban agenda. Ms. Sanya Seth is a development professional with over 11 years' experience working on issues of gender equality and women's rights. Her work focuses on mainstreaming gender within policies and in programs on violence against women and girls and women's human rights, women's economic rights. She's currently working with the UN Women Office for India, Bhutan, Maldives, and Sri Lanka as the program lead for intergovernmental processes and women, peace and security. Her work at UN Women largely involves policy analysis, capacity building, advocacy, and program management on substantive gender equality. She holds an MA in Women's Studies from the Tata Institute of Social Science, Mumbai. So welcome again to the three of you. And, we talked about a set of issues and questions that we would structure the chat around, but I want to start a little bit before that. Each of you has a special connection to the Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995, and I thought it would be nice if we started with your telling us about it briefly. And I know, Sanya, you weren't there, but because you've been involved with the reviews, I think you qualify for the same question. So, Dr. Ruth?
At the outset, I would like to thank Swarna for bringing, especially three of us. We are like the, three in three corners, been contributing this process. So there is a lot of, connection between all of us. At the outset, I would like to state that the Beijing Declaration and Beijing Platform for Action was an outcome of years of struggle and activism and advocacy by the global feminist movement, and the Indian women is part of the global work. If you really look at India, in India, a group of inter-facilitating agencies set up a coordination unit for which Suneeta Dhar was the coordinator, national coordinator. And actually the preparation for 1995 started previously, for 3 years itself, from 1992 onwards, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what the coordination unit has done, they've gathered women to share their experiences and contribute to the formation of, to share experiences and contribute to the formation of the platform for action. Later, closest to Beijing, an advisory group was formed among the coordination unit, and we have later formed into a national alliance of women. Actually, we were the one who gave an 8-point agenda to government, very crucial, declaration, kind of what government need to do to the then Narasimha Rao government. And Madhavrao Scindia was the human resource development man, and that very nice woman called Swarna Rajagopalan was the secretary. Nowadays, you are so afraid even to go, to secretary's room. And this woman was available to all of us. We were able to sit down and discuss with her. And there was another man called Mr. Guha, and later he worked in the UN here in New Delhi as well as in New York. And actually, we have told to all the government officers, government officials who are going to participate in the government, discussions, that we said that please don't talk about that we women are gods and goddesses in our country, like we are all well, we are this and that. Instead, bring most crucial issues that we women are facing. And then, we have put forth our agenda to the high level, to the Prime Minister of India. And we, 17 to 18 of us went to there and gave, and then we had a conference of commitment. I think if you really look at it, we really moved very fast. There was a scope around the time. There was a time that, women were able to talk to government, interact with government, interface with government, and sit down and talk to them. And we said that these are the realities. And when they formulate, these are the things should be done. After which, I think, after the 12, 12 concrete issues that has been raised, then each one of us really followed in the National Alliance of Women. And I think, maybe like I talk about it a little later, I think it's a momentum has started all over the world, and specifically in India. Lot of women who have come, not only just, the scholars and academics. I wanted to make this point very clearly. People at the grassroots level were the vanguard of, that transformatory agenda to come, not only in India, for all over, but for India for the first time, that, the groups who never heard about even UN, they were able to, come and talk. I think the fundamental linkages that has been brought between equality, development, peace, from the grassroots level to the state level to the national level. Therefore, we took it to the so this has been actually the process. And there are many women were part of this. I think around 500 women were in the initial stages contributing all over, all regions. So it's a document itself is a kind of a consensus document which came from, the grassroots level till the global level. So Beijing was really a memory. And I think in many of our lives, it has taken quite a number of years. It is like, when I was 40s, I came into the Beijing process. Then even I felt that I was already old, at the age of 40 to carry on this experiences. But I think that many of us really at our youth, just after our work at the local level, we came into the national level to work on this, Beijing platform. If you ask me, I will go on talking. I think others will talk now. Yeah.
Suneeta?
Thank you, Swarna, for the second session. I was there part of the first session, and I enjoyed listening to colleagues from the South who talked about their journeys. Thank you, Ruth. And hello to everybody. Amu is also here. She was at Beijing. I'm not sure Nisha was at Beijing, but one of the key thing about Beijing conference was looking at the world through women's eyes. And I think the question we asked was the eyes of which women? And I think that underpinned the politics by which we organized and held consultations and convenings and dialogues and yatras and campaigns. Because one realized that we are in a very diverse country. And as Ruth said, there was this, thanks to the inter-facilitating agency on Beijing, which was a network of donor agencies with the lead role played by Karuna. In fact, maybe one day we should get all of those women who played a key role in getting resources to the table and being absolutely behind the scenes in supporting this process. We were a technical unit. We were there to basically support the process. We were not representing the process any which way. And it was the advisory committee that had representatives from around the country. And they guided. And there was also a sister unit in Bangalore, which was supported there by Shobha Raghuram, who was at that time. We should get Shobha also to the table. And dealing with the huge numbers of issues and the huge outreach that was possible was also because most people who were associated with the Beijing process were also part of many social movements, the women's movement, the farmers movement, the tribal movements, Narmada Bachao Andolan, the autonomous women's movements, and also women's economic activities, etc., etc. Um, and I think what was possible was, how does representation really look? Everyone cannot go to a conference, but the spirit of how do our voices go to the conference was the spirit by which all these consultations were organized, that we won't be there, but there are people from amongst our collectives who will go. And she will then come back and tell us what happened, and we will then be part of the process. So the spiral learning process was built into it. That you didn't just go there for the conference, wherever you went. There were many preparatory conferences, both in India and in Asia and other places. But you also came back. So there was an accountability system that was built into the process of reporting, of sharing, of transmitting. And I think that's something that the feminist learning process was in a way woven into the Beijing conference. And I think that's the way feminists even work today. We have digital platforms today. And we must remember that those days we neither had emails nor we had the telephones, we had the telexes, and we had ourselves. And, what better ways of communicating than feminist ways of communicating? We were a unit of 10 people with excellent colleagues, and I think at some point I really feel we should get everybody around the table. But and it was very intensive work. How do
The plan,
resources
Suneeta.
get shared?
That's
How
a
do,
plan.
yeah, that's what we can do, because I think just honoring, celebrating, and also recognizing the work of so many women together. It was a collective effort, honestly, at the end of the day. But I'd also like to say, over and above what Ruth has said, that we also had a very strong, we had a strong relationship with the South Asian feminists. So the group from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh, from Nepal, we actually worked very closely together, and we shared with each other what we were doing. And we met at these Asian conferences. Bangkok, there used to be a convening meeting that was being held every 3 months or 2 months, I can't remember. So there was a lot of information flow in those ways, and we worked and I also remember that at the conference itself, there was a South Asian walk as well. Now we must remember that there was no homogeneous agenda. Yeah, there were differences. There were differences in the way that the issues were articulated, the way that development agendas were being pursued. But partnerships also, partnerships were pursued, as Ruth has said very well, that the openings within the government, pushing the government, bringing on board the voices and the work of many women, giving it visibility, getting the studies. It was also the time that for the first time in the National Report of India, the voices of Northeast women, first time ever Northeast India was represented. They were never part of the previous conferences. So a chapter on their voices, a chapter on other issues that were never included in the national reports earlier happened. It was also a time that the first shadow report, because India was reporting on the CEDAW, so Madhu Mehra, along with many other friends, colleagues around the table, convened the first and organized the first shadow report of India on CEDAW. So we were all part of history, her stories in some way, breaking some structural barriers in engaging with those that don't normally go to conferences. And it was also the first time that, as I said earlier, it was a conference in Asia. So it was possible for us to participate in such large numbers. And somehow Beijing conference, because of it being in Beijing, China, Huairou, I mean, they had to create Huairou because the numbers were so enormous, also allowed for that kind of participation and inclusion to some extent. It was not easy. It was very hard, but I think it taught all of us how to work with each other, how to be for each other, and how to make sure that women leaders were speaking and were supported in doing what they had to do. So there were, I mean, I remember the Great Wall of China. Dastakar had made this huge quilt with a, they had asked every women's group to send a small piece, and then they made this quilt and they took it all the way to the Great Wall of China, and then it rained and it became so heavy that I think Pramada just left the quilt there because it was impossible, because, the Beijing conference also had, apart from a lot of celebration and events, there was also rain and some difficulties and all of that stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, fundamentally, I think the women leaders went through a transformative journey. When they went back to their villages, they were felicitated, they talked about issues, they were able to take their issues forward. So yeah, it was quite an amazing experience. Thank you.
Sanya, do you want to add
Yeah.
something to that? Yeah.
Yes, Swarnaji, thank you. And such rich experiences, just to think that I was actually in fourth standard at that time when Beijing was happening. So I really don't have that kind of an experience, that kind of, just, the history to be laid out. But just, especially because I am representing UN Women, I think to answer this, I will go back to the genesis of UN Women, because UNIFEM at that time and now UN Women came into existence with feminist groups across the globe advocating for the agenda to be institutionalized and mainstreamed across the UN system. And this was, I think, possible only with the wave of feminist movement within the 1990s, especially the Beijing, that really pushed at that time the Secretary General to actually establish UNIFEM at that time. And that for me is one of the biggest outcomes for Beijing as I can relate it to. But, not having participated then, but I do have an opportunity to participate now, because now that we are reflecting 25 years later, the Beijing Charter and the roadmap, we are also entering into this process of a more updated and a more focused feminist agenda setting through the Generation Equality campaign that builds on the Beijing Platform for Action and the declaration. And how I am looking at it is also more excited to engage with the process of, reflecting on the realities back then and the newer, fast-paced changing world now, to look at what are some of the priorities that we need to bring on the agenda, negotiate at the decision-making tables now, but also bring in more consciously the perspective of younger generation. Because I think that now that we are looking at also that kind of a transition to newer voices, newer generations, taking on the baton of the agenda that was set 25 years ago. I think that's where I am more excited to be a part of that transition, but also to learn more, to synergize more with diverse set of groups and bring on that feminist agenda that we all are aspiring for.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with one of those, listicle type questions. So as we entered the review season last year, in 2019, and with meetings and projects all over the place, what would you have said off the cuff was the biggest success? I mean, on which one measure have we done best on the Beijing platform? This is a warm-up question, so just one. Because then afterwards we'll have lots to say about the things that didn't go well. So there's one thing that we've done not so badly on, what would it be?
What we have done the best.
Yes. We can actually feel a little happy about.
I think the pre-Beijing process was kind of a milestone that the women in large number have got used to enter into the parliament, enter into the government offices. Once, we met, Suneeta would agree with me. We went to meet Mr. Manmohan Singh. Yeah. Then Mr. Manmohan Singh was the finance minister. Every time you would sit with us and run to the table to bring how much money he has given for women, how much budget he has given for women. given for everything else, but we say what you're given for us. In education, how much you're given. In health, how much you're given. How much employment you're given to women in this country. So that, really, I would say it gave the women's movement legitimacy to fight for our right, the Beijing platform for action. And I think written from there, that we would really kind of get into the department, phone up and fix up an appointment, go and talk to them. And we have done this for several years from then onwards. So it is a kind of a legitimacy, I would say, that in public platform and policy, in governance, you imagine that women from the women's movement has been called for discussing about budget for the country. Like we went to the planning commissions, like many of us, I remember Pam Rajput, myself, and there was Neelam Chaturvedi, Neelam Gore, and many other. There was people in Delhi were participating before, maybe very old feminists who were working on policies and all, they would have invited, but we were very new. So it has really opened the gate for us to talk about gender responsive budgeting, recognizing advantage, distinct disadvantage where what women across the world and in India face. I think to me that as citizens of India, we were able to put on to the table that these are our issues. How are you going to respond? You are a signatory to the document. What are you going to do? What are your priorities? What is your budget allocations? I think for me, this is a very major one. In the non-governmental side, what has happened? In the NGO and all that, there were many women's rights groups has emerged. All those women came to the conference. They went back not only buying things from China. I mean, China was cheap. And, they were taking so much of books at one point of time when we are returning. The books were so much the coordination unit has to pay a very big money for carrying these books. They carried, and then what did they do? Went back, and then several women's rights organizations, not more of welfareist orientation, but women's rights organization, grassroots collectives, and national networks were formed. For example, National Alliance of Women was born out of the Beijing process to carry forward the work to ensure the government to keep up these commitments. I would stop here. You're asked only one, isn't it? Yeah.
Suneeta or Sanya?
I mean, Ruth has said it quite well. I think a thing that really strikes, I mean, I was there for a short time. The unit was just 2 years old, actually. December 1993 to December 1995 is when the lifetime of the unit was there. And then, of course, National Alliance of Women was leading us then and took it on thereafter. It brought to mind how interconnected we were. Many of us had never been really to conferences. We didn't know anything about the UN. We didn't know about multilateralism. We didn't know about local is global and global is local. So I think this understanding of the fact that many of our issues are interconnected with the issues of the global women's movement, and that the movements were to a large extent working on similar issues, maybe with different strategies or different analyses. But that interconnectedness strikes me as one of the very positive things that came out of Beijing. And I think today also our movements are so interdependent, and how we work together in coalitions, broad platforms, thematically across for social justice, democracy, and for a better world. Another thing that came to us was also an analysis which showed us that you're not just talking about a global south, you're also talking about a global south in the global north, and a global north in the global south. So you were studying, looking at poverty in a structural manner and looking at how capitalism, neoliberalism, etc., functioned, and what did it mean for rights of the dispossessed and those that were on the margins. We also began to question who were really the ones on the margin, because not all women uh, have the same entitlements or the same privileges. And so even starting to look at the differences, the voices of the tribal women, indigenous women, the voices of Dalit women, the issues of caste, the issues of discrimination, and several such issues did come up, women's identities, the issues of sexuality. I think the feminist groups raised the issues of sexuality. It wasn't something that was being discussed. There was a lot of pushback on what is the normative structure of a family. And so, to me, connecting with the regional movements, social movements, women's movements itself was one of the huge gain, I think, which allowed us also to continue to work when we came back to our countries or to our regions or to thematic groups to take the agenda ahead. And those friendships remain. I mean, look at the number of regional networks that continue to work on women, peace and security, that work on feminization of poverty, that work on ending violence against women, that work on indigenous rights, that work climate, and all came up later. But, so many of the continuing journeys that forged their solidarity, forged their analyses, learned from each other, and built, despite the differences, built, solidarity and love for each other, I think is a huge gain from that process.
It's interesting to me, before we come to you, Sanya, that I asked actually in the context of the Beijing Plus 25 reviews, but both Ruth and Suneeta have talked about the Beijing process itself and how it transformed women's lives, women's movements, feminist organizing. So that's really interesting to me. Sanya, would you want to talk about the actual reviews that were done last year, and any one thing that you would say was a positive finding or a success story?
Sure. So we did do a Beijing review last year for the 25 years. We'd all, at least from India, we had a huge group that had gone to Bangkok. And I think for me, what stood out was not one thing, but actually three things. And I'll just put them very, very briefly in the interest of time. We did see a 3-day long civil society forum where women's organizations and their collectives were able to come together, assess and strategize the priorities that they wanted to push, form a collective narrative for the negotiations to happen. And this was very beautifully put under, the categories of anger, hope, and action, which was very powerful for me to see how we've collectivized ourselves and we are displaying our anger, our hope, and the actions that one would want to see as an outcome from those Asia Pacific review dialogues. The second, of course, was that, in the room of leaders of the states, women's organizations were able to very, very difficultly, but still able to negotiate to be a part of that dialogue, because otherwise it's a closed room negotiation with just the UN entities and the member states in that room. So I think we were still able to put a foot in the door, not in large numbers, but at least send the representatives there and trying to, influence those decisions and the adoption of the Beijing 25 outcome. Understand what the roadblocks were and carry those corridor lobbies according to that. So I think that putting the foot in the door for these very important decision-making dialogues was also very important for me. And the third, of course, was that for the first time, I saw that there was a conscious effort to include young voices in the intergovernmental processes. Feminists across the globe convene spaces to reflect on their lived realities, consolidate the emerging priorities, and set the agenda for the future, for the future action and advocacy that they wanted to take up. And of course, Priyanka is there in the room. She had written a beautiful article on the young feminist statement that one had brought out for the first time in a Beijing review process, which really did put the heart, and I'm just quoting from her um, uh, 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 article, that at the heart of the Young Feminist Forum was the unpacking of how gender identities and abilities interact with social constructs such as patriarchy, caste, religion, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, conflict setting, citizenship, etc., to shape the experiences and outcomes. So these were the three biggest things for me to take away.
Thank you. So then, because for some reason, we're all very good at critiques. So let's look at the 3-4 areas that emerged as the big failures, the places where progress since 1995 has been particularly disappointing. Each of us has a long laundry list of these complaints. But if you had to pick the 4 that were perhaps the most surprising, and this would have been an easy enough fix, but in 25 years it hasn't happened, what would each of you pick? Sanya, Suneeta, Ruth, anyone? Why don't you start, Sanya, since they've turned off their video for the moment? Oh, Suneeta's back.
Sorry, Suneeta ji should go first.
Go ahead, Sanya.
I think for us, if I were to, pick, my first would definitely be, how we are still struggling to make the agenda, a priority. It is still such an underfunded agenda. I think that I see as one of the biggest failures, that one, together with the UN Women and other UN agencies, but also particularly women's movement, the civil society organizations, women's collectives, is all dealing with. And I think that's one of the biggest failures, that even after 25 years of narrating the importance of investing in feminist agenda, we are still not there. And if I were to, look at some of the global statistics, I think there's only 5% of what globally the grant-making organizations contribute to a gender agenda, and that's very, very disheartening. And that shows that the struggle is too long and too difficult for one. I think the second, and this is something that all of us keep talking about to each other bilaterally, is also that, what I saw at the Asia Pacific conference last year, and prior to that also at the Commission on Status of Women, other UN meetings, was the declining voices of Indian women, which are increasingly fragmenting and deteriorating. So I see that as a lack of support and investment again in the feminist voices. And of course, within the bigger picture, in terms of where the feminist agenda stands on global priorities. And that reflects equally on UN Women. So I think these are two big things that I see as the biggest failure.
Would one of you?
They 25 years, every 5 years there's to be a review of Beijing, the Beijing agenda. And the analysis is all there, the data is all there to see for everybody. And it says no one country achieved equality in this period of time. So there's a huge agenda. Yes, gains have been made, and I think we should talk about the gains that have been made, because they have been made because of the persistence and the pressures and the work of the women's organizations, unpaid care work, so to speak. But we know that the gaps were huge, and now with COVID, they have put us back into the dock. So what would be some of them? I mean, I was just thinking that we were not even able to, in the MDG agenda, put violence against women as one of the targets. Women's groups And we know the formulation of the MDG in what context of global politics and post-Cold War that was taking place. I won't go there, but I know that women's groups came together for the SDG agenda, and a lot of what was in the Beijing Platform for Action, in CEDAW, in 1325 Security Council resolutions, the dots were being connected for the SDG agenda. So a lot of gains were made, and women's groups adopted that agenda and want to work on it. However, one of the agendas and goals of the SDGs is leave no one behind. But if you look at it from the Beijing Platform for Action, the fact of gender equality, peace, development, justice, we know that that agenda is far from ever being met. We know the structural racism, casteism, exclusion, prejudices, etc., that are there in the system, the kind of feminization of poverty that exists, the kind of burdens that women workers carry and women in terms of the unpaid care work. And we know all of that has come to the fore as critical agendas post-COVID, and what economic policies have we been following and how equitable and just are they, and who is benefiting from it. And we know in the context of COVID, which industries are benefiting and who are the ones that have not even had access to food security, minimal food security, leave alone health, and access to a wage, a decent wage and dignity. So there's a huge gap when we look at it there. And yet when we look at COVID today, who's taken the brunt of the work? It's been women, the frontline workers, the health workers, women at home, the care economy, taking care of the elderly, etc., making masks in India, the self-help groups, and the kinds of resilience that they have shown in rebuilding their fragile economies and their precarious lives. The second agenda that I've always seen as something that has never been met is that while we have made progress at the level of policies and laws, there's been a huge gap between the intent and the practice. The implementation has always been an issue, and each of the Beijing reports that the government's reflected on every 5 years, this agenda has always come up, implementation. That means the institutions that were mandated to carry out these agendas, the multi-sectorality of efforts never took place. And Sanya and Ruth have mentioned about resources. There hasn't ever been resources to finance the gender equality agenda, to finance feminism, to finance women workers. We're still today in India part of a women and child development agenda, of which largely close to 90% goes for children and should go for children, definitely, but we're left with very little for women. So where is, we need another system and a structure and investments of a different kind. The third issue that I've always seen that has come up and is being addressed, and there are groups around the world speaking about it, is also redefining gender and going beyond the binaries. There is no one gender, it's not about men and women. It's, we're talking about the LGBTQ community, we're talking about those that are, gender fluid, those that have several other gender and sexual identities, and how do we really, include them in the policy making, in the decisions that affect their life, in the laws that govern, and in their rights to be realized as citizens, not as those that are beneficiaries of the system, but really citizenship. And another issue has also been about accountability and governance. Where does accountability, the fragmentation and polarization that's been taking place worldwide, have been non-transparent over a period of time. And so while programs and schemes are being devised, there hasn't been a consultative mechanism in place. And what concerns me more is while there are programs and schemes and budgets, we don't have any evaluation data. So statistics, monitoring and accountability, I mean, where is the data? Is it gender disaggregated? Do we have the specific data that will help us redesign our policies, that will help women to also know how to work with their local authorities and redesign policies at the grassroots level, work with their panchayats, etc. So there's a huge gap out there. And I know some bits of it are being bridged because of the SDG commitments, but I think a lot more has to be done.
Ruth?
Can you hear me? Okay. I think not only in India, I think a major stock taking UN Women report says that no country has fully delivered on the commitments. I think if you kind of summarizes one sentence, no country has fully delivered on the commitments of the Beijing Platform for Action. Nor is it closer, nor is it close to it at all. In the Indian context, I think what emerged as failures are primarily normative gaps and gaps in the domain of implementation of laws and programs meant for the advance of women's rights. Yeah, I think some of the thing has been said. So I would, come to areas which are not in a mention. I think women violence against women has enacted a legal framework to prevent and respond to violence against women. However, the implementation of the laws and the implementation of recommendation of Justice Verma Committee has been so much disappointing. Good reports, but nothing has been done. It's a whole question of implementation and accountability. I wanted to reiterate what Suneeta had said. The stark increase of violent crimes against women. God, you sit down and work in an office, every day. They hear things that you hear that women have been, under law. They've been, um, one example I wanted to say, like, men marry women to live with them in the same house. One man saying, like, I won't say anything to you, but you live in this house. I mean, I was wondering what kind of, like, the kind of normative gaps that exist within the psyche of men. I think it's a very big thing. So I think stark increase of violent crimes. Every 5 women in 100,000 population has been, the average rate of reported cases of rape. It looks very small, 5 on 100 lakhs, but if you take India, it's a very, very, very big number. So all the other things I don't want to go, but I would say, when you talk about violence, I also wanted to bring the escalation of caste-based violence and communal-based violences today. I think we cannot just forget that. 8 Dalit women are raped every day. That is the statistics. The reported high level of violence against
We've lost Ruth.
Looks like it. Just give her a second to come back in, or
Yeah, that's okay.
perhaps what we can do is to move on to the next section, and Ruth can finish when she comes back in. We're sitting here in lockdown, many of us, with this invisible virus that is an elephant in our rooms. So let me now ask about COVID. COVID had a big impact on everything that we were supposed to do this year. But my question is, in what ways did it reinforce the assessments we made last year around progress on the Beijing platform? How have we fared in our response to COVID-19? Is it how we would expect based on our Beijing assessments last year? Are we doing better, surprisingly, in some sphere? or are we doing worse? Are our assessments being undermined? So essentially, I'm saying, can we reflect on the Beijing reviews, not the platform itself, but our reviews and our conclusions? Um, Ruth is back.
I think
Yes.
somewhere the wire got disconnected. And
Happy to have you back.
okay, I think violence against women, one talked about it, like for the implementation of the laws and all that, we have no resources. Sanya said it beautifully. The escalation of caste-based violences. The report of high level of violence against women in conflict affected areas, Kashmir, Northeast, Chhattisgarh, including various forms of sexual violences, enforced disappearance, killings, and act of torture, treatment due to the provision of Armed Force Special Powers Act. I think, on conflicts, the last, report that we have written, if you can see the fourth and the fifth alternative report are given a very big, account of the women in conflict. I think, it really says that, these issues are not, dealt with sensitivity. The lack of gender sensitive intervention and insufficient resources are also main cause. I wanted to reiterate that. And second big thing I would say, apart from violence against women, the political participation of women at the decision making levels. I think it's a very, very bad scenario. And in the decision making bodies at all levels, women from 49% of the electorate, but only 14% of MPs in parliament. It looks very big, 14 again. It's only about 35 women who are sitting over there. 33% was a promise that is given to us that we will come up in the Legislative Assembly and Parliament. I think it's a very, very serious issue. If women's participation policy remains unattended, which is the most important institution of society that is related to power and decision-making processes, I think this is one of the things that, we have utterly failed in India. It shows, the patriarchal, values very deeply rooted in our country, in society, as well as also among the political parties and politicians. I mean, I think the COVID has really thrown this big issue of women labor and employment. With this, I will stop. The gender gap that is shown, women earn only to 50 to 60% of the wages earned by men. That women in India only own 12% of land. The latest NSSO data states that out of 50 million home-based workers in South Asia, 37.4 million live and work in India alone, and we are the largest contingent. We all know that decline female labor, labor force participation, both in rural and in urban areas. Very recently, the government is also deciding that 26 PSUs will be completely sold off to private, private firms and, fully disinvested. Like, PSU, 26 PSU, goes in a band to the hands of the private sectors, what is the situation going to be. And then we see the greater, gender disparity, unpaid work. Despite Beijing platform action having envisioned gender equality in all dimensions of life, and with 25 years of struggle and resistance, transformational changes yet to be seen in the lives of women, especially marginalized women in the country. I think, we have already talked about, we continue to face multiple and intersecting forms of marginalization, resulting in acute socioeconomic and political inequalities. Therefore, the critical question is whether gender mainstreaming as a strategy has been meaningfully translated into action or not. That is why today we have been insisting that intersectionality, issue has to be raised. People, the rulers as well as the administrators not only have a gender lens to look at the lives of women, but also they have to look at people of the marginalized section. So there should be a greater lenses have to be worn in order to address the issues of women. So I think in the area of political participation, violence against women and women and labor, I think I would say we have fared very bad actually, in a very acute situation that we are facing.
So let's go down to talking about COVID and our experience with COVID, our response to COVID. In what way do you think it has reinforced the assessments that were made last year? In what way does it undermine or challenge them? Are we doing better than you expected, worse than you expected based on all the data you looked at last year? So what's the COVID lens on the Beijing assessments?
You want me to talk or?
I can only see you right now because the other two are in hiding.
Okay. I think it's a very important momentum in our lives. I think the whole world's, life, people have always seen, we have never seen something like this. So I would say that we are at a critical moment in history. Therefore, feminists across the globes are convening spaces to reflect on their lived reality, consolidate emerging priorities, and set the agenda for future action and for advocacy. I think there was a clear-cut exposure of the fragility of our system during the COVID time. The COVID-19 crisis has forced us to carry out to this 25th anniversary celebration online across distances and borders. It's the most important, time. But now, we are able to only see, but we don't even, because we are not able to gather. The younger women wanted to go to all these meetings and participated. I think that, it has really forced us to be in one place and then, having conversations. I think it exposed the fragility of our system is a very important point to me. I think that, if I would say that there is a greater compounded economic impact on women. One is like if they're already, their presence and participation, wage level parity is not there. Today, in the context of COVID, there we would see an impact, compounded economic impact, worse. Secondly, I would say the health of women adversely impacted because we did not have a social security system which would attend to everybody's health needs. I think it was a total failure. Even today, people sitting in office, people sitting at home do not know where to go and get treatment. I was just now recently working on it. A girl who is in Bahrain, and she's there. They come from a upper middle class society. They can treat her mother, but they do not know where to take the mother. The whole house has been quarantined. So I think the health of women adversely impacted. And then the unpaid care work has increased. Like the children, the old, and everybody is at home today. So the women have more work instead of going out work. So the unpaid care work has increased the burden on women. I think restricted movement being forced into lockdown. Women have been locked down once more, I would say, that many of them were not able to get out, even to go and tell somebody that I've been, affected by my husband or men in the family. I think when COVID has been, whatever they've been planning and doing, it came all of a sudden. It is not even planned or anything. But I think that there is not women's participation at all in planning COVID, in planning how to treat, how to mitigate the suffering of COVID-19. Also, when it comes to the wage laborers, the construction workers, workers in stone quarries, bricklin, sanitation workers, cleaners in a hospital, most of the marginalized women are part of these. So government plans in response to the pandemic did not factor women at all, reiterating the position that women are an afterthought of policymakers. Health sector, I have already told you. The conditions of the migrant workers. I think most of the poor and the marginalized are the migrant workers. There is a statistics that everybody knows that the pandemic will push 47 million more women and girls below the poverty line. So what we have gained after the Beijing, the poverty reduction programs, now it has a very, very clear indication. It will push 47 million more and girls below the poverty line. I think women have been talking about, the unorganized sector laborers have been talking about, especially social security measures. We've been talking about it and talking about it. No action has been taken. If only social security has become part, social security for all and social security for the unorganized sectors could have, avoided lot of difficulties. People would have had money in their hands. They would have gone for treatment. They would have bought their, rations. Nothing is possible around this time. We already know.
Ruth's connection is acting up again. Suneeta, Sanya, do you want to start and we can come back and she can finish?
Yeah, just briefly, and we can get our other friends also to speak. Priyanka is there. I think Ruth has said a lot. She's already covered a very wide host of issues. And I was just looking at, I was at the Bangkok Asia Pacific meeting and I was looking at the recommendations in the statement that were made by the feminist groups. I was part of the group that drafted that statement. And I was looking at it, and in the context of today, it couldn't have been truer. I mean, it wasn't as if these things did not exist. It's just that in the context of COVID, things got worse, right? They got exacerbated, they got some visibility and attention, but the price that has been paid is huge. Our health systems have never been in place. We've never had the kind of investment of our GDP for access to health, sexual reproductive services. We know that millions of women did not get access to maternal care, abortion services, contraception, safe pregnancies. We know that. I mean, it's all around us. We know that young women didn't get access to services. So the healthcare system, though I must say, worked very hard to cope with the fallout of the COVID and to address the new virus. It really got into a binary for a long time, and now I think some of the other services are coming on, beginning to function. It was only COVID-related services, and so there was nothing else that was happening. I also want to pick up on the point that I've been trying to look at data around. UN Women has brought out some of the most excellent documentation, and many of the other groups. There have been enormous amount of studies, and I'm so impressed by the data that's coming up, at least, and the quickness of responses. However, we know that much of the data that comes from the NGOs in this country who have the resources lack a gender perspective. Forget the state. I mean, Ruth has made the point. We didn't have the resources to do a national study. We didn't have the human resources to bring things together. So all of us did small studies in our communities, whereas others did these huge studies. But whatever be it, the merits of the studies, there is so much data. The Dalit groups, the National Campaign for Dalit Human Rights, CBGA, gender budgets, etc. Now, how are all these recommendations being taken up? And that is where the huge gap lies. Who is looking at these recommendations, the work that has happened, the sweat and blood, that would provide immediate kind of relief or to provide immediate kind of new forms of interventions or support to those that are, suffering the worst impact of the pandemic? We don't know where those mechanisms lie. There have been press conferences, there have been people's parliament, there have been many things. Even women's groups have a campaign about raising their voices collectively, putting the data together. So I think there's a huge gap between the response, the policy framing, and the work of the groups on the ground across the country. Of course, at some state levels, there has been some bits of negotiation and some bits of voice that has influenced some of the state governments, but largely that has been missing. I also think that the point that Ruth talked about being in the midst of a conflict, I think COVID has also heightened new forms of conflict and stigmatization. We already had a society that was polarized. The issues that minority women and men are facing, the issues of queer and transgender, the issues of stigmatization faced by sex workers, all of that along with new forms of social polarization, attacks on women human rights defenders and human rights defenders, um, the, 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 the wrong use of law, the use of sedition, the use of UAPA terrorism for non-violent protests is something that is alarming. I mean, this is really alarming because it's taking away voice, it's taking the space, it's taken away the constructive space for dissent and also for a space for dialogue. Lots of groups are asking for dialogue. They're saying, listen to us, hear what we have to say. And that space is just not there. And that is what some of the recommendations that came from the Asia Pacific as well as the India groups had it out there. There was also an issue of food sovereignty and right to land, assets. All of those are issues today. Had our agricultural policies been different, had our assetization processes been different, had there been equality amongst communities and within households, and women's access to a lot of assets and land and decision making would have been of a different order. And the third lot, the last of the lot that Ruth has talked about, and I do not want to repeat those points. I also think it has brought to light that we were so happy with the fact that everybody had a cell phone, but that did not translate to digital access to technology. Okay, because we know that today the world is running on technology. We are running on technology out here. But we are struggling in taking training sessions in Jharkhand with the women who are out in the districts with whom we are working. Their phones cannot work on any of the platforms. And so now we are trying to do a hybrid model of on-site with friends that are out, with organizations out there, with the backup support, the TOG. So, access to technology, not just technology for education, which is needed for the children, but also to reducing the burden on women, Now, the access to the gas cylinder was difficult because the supplies were not there. The supplies were cut. As a result of this, women had to walk kilometers to go and collect firewood. So we need technology of very different kinds. There's lack of affordable transportation today. There's a whole lot of new things that have to be done, and I think we need to look at appropriate technology in agriculture and livelihoods, platforms for domestic workers, the service sector workers, and how could they use these platforms to access their jobs and to make sure that the conditions of work apply for them at work, etc., etc. So I think there are some of these things I see, that it has been in a continuum. Thank you.
Ruth, you were speaking, and if you want to wrap up in a minute or so Sanya can. Unmute.
Actually, in order to reverse what has happened, that I think that we really need to bring about, as already told by Sanya, the intersectoral approach is very much important, because intersectoral approaches recognize there is no homogeneous women. Not all women are put together, we are one. We come from different social locations. Therefore, marginalized women are disproportionately affected by any crisis. Whether it is the negative impact of the economy or pandemic or climate change, we are the one who are really affected by it. So I think an intersectional approach is very much needed. I think in 1991 itself, Kimberly Crenshaw and I highlighted the intersectional oppression faced by Black and Dalit women. There was a conference was taking place around that time. CSW had organized it before the racism conference in Durban. So it goes beyond monolithic understanding of race and caste. So we need to highlight the triple marginalization faced by our women, as we are at the bottom of the caste, race, gender, and class hierarchies. I think the 2030 agenda, governments committed to leave no one behind. I think Sustainable Development Goal talks about it very, in a good manner, that we will not leave no one behind. But we know that there are many people have been left behind. I think the comment means they must invest in data, innovative research, analysis that make visible the needs of women and girls facing overlapping forms of discrimination. I think we also need to redress the past injustices that is done to people. I think the Blacks in America are talking about this. We need, relief. We need relief, rehabilitation, and restorative justice for women who have been affected by these, this triple alienation. I would also say that you have been already talked about not only the women in conflict and also the female identities, newer identity, male sexual minorities, LGBTQI and community. I think historically the understanding on gender has been intent to only gender binaries that we all know. Now we need to really expand the discourse and compel the governments also to look at it. Therefore, altogether, we need to really build an inclusive and intersectional feminist future. If we want to really build, I think these approaches are needed. A good facilitative mechanism that we needed. And I would also say that movement building has to continue. We can have papers and papers, documents after documents. Fidel Castro had said in one of the meetings, in one of the conferences, where in Durban, we cannot eat papers. We need justice. We need food in our hand. We have, health facilities available to us. That is why he concentrated on primary schools everywhere, healthcare system everywhere. Today, is that country really, is wanting to help people and give vaccines to others? Nobody really wanted to get it from them. So I think that we need to build. I think, the words like the government, I would also call this binaries, government and non-governments. I think that, women committed to Beijing, the platform for action, and the newer generation of younger people are coming. And we need to build up this movement. Collective action has to undertake and finding common ground in order to advocacy of women to be effective. I think we must broaden the civil society spaces. Today, civil society neither have spaces nor money to do things. As Suneeta said, we have very little money to help 500 women, 200 women, Only that is why we are fighting with governments. They must frame the policies in advancing gender equality in times of war, in times of crisis, and also in normal times. I think, this is what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ruth. Sanya, give you the last word on this particular discussion.
I will also take it a little more broader, because everybody's talked about it in detail. But when I was sitting in that room where the last 2 days of negotiations happened, I would reflect on some of the things that we did not include in our outcome document, that we fought for very hard but were not accepted. And there are three very, very clear areas. First, I would like to bring up the short-sighted, the short-sightedness of today's situation as climate crisis. What we really adopted was a climate change, but one doesn't recognize it as a crisis situation. And I'm hoping that COVID realities would bring us up to speed to say that this is now a global crisis for us to work on. And climate has a big role to play in all of this. The second, and of course both Suneeta ji and Ruth have brought this up, is the kind of leadership and empowerment that we were pushing for women in conflict and humanitarian setting was something that was not accepted. And the third, of course, was greater participation, collaboration, and engagement with the civil society organizations. I think there was a big apprehension to work more collaboratively with civil society and feminist groups by the governments. And that shows now also in our response. And I'm also then reflecting on this one feminist collective statement that, of course, Ruth was there on the table, Suneeta ji was there, I was there, we were formulating, the statement from the women's groups to go, and Ruth read one of the statements on ending violence against women in the big UN hall. I think, just picking from some of those, what we do see in that context is, of course, safety and, sexual and gender-based violence. Because in COVID context, I think it's become increasingly more clear that, the stress of domestic violence, the stress of sexual exploitation was, unfortunately, we are calling it the shadow pandemic right now, but it was never a shadow, so to say. But it was very, very clear that one was probably delaying to accept as a reality and work on that. The economic livelihoods, because there is that kind of a unique and very, very differential impact that, so women are uniquely and differently hit by the economic impacts. And especially with COVID, we are seeing different studies that bring out those nuances much more clearly. We've talked also about the disproportionate burden of care work and unpaid work that women in these
Sanya has frozen. Sanya. Okay. You're on mute, Swarna.
No, I just realized. Let her come back and she can finish up. But I'd like to go to the last question, and I'm going to make this a short 30-second answer so we can squeeze in some amount of... Sanya, finish.
Sorry.
And then I'll go to my question.
Sorry. No, so I don't know where... I did hear Suneeta ji telling me that I'm frozen, but anyway, I was talking about also the inclusion aspect, and that also comes with a great deal of us not being so willing to collaborate and engage with civil society and women's organizations, because you see that the voices of women and girls are not being included to inform your COVID response. And it couldn't be more clearer there. So I think just if I were to break down these 4-5 indicators, so to say, which is violence against women, economic livelihoods, care work and unpaid work, inclusion of diverse voices, and also incorporating some of those within our policy mechanisms, using gender data, and using gender responsive plans. I think those are now, when I reflect back, I see, the apprehension building from the November meeting that we had last year to now how the COVID has been unfolded and what the response has been so far.
So what I want to finish with before we open up for discussion, if you had to revise the Beijing Platform for Action, given what we've learned during COVID, what would you add and what would you underscore even more strongly? And I'm going to say 1 minute so that we can still find at least 3 to 4 minutes of scheduled time. So Suneeta?
Ruth has dropped out, is it?
What would you add to the platform or underscore?
I could add a lot more on the rights of LGBTQI, the queer, the rights of sex workers, domestic workers, a lot on identities of workers and their right to livelihoods and equal citizenship. I would also add more on women with disabilities, because that was quite missing in the platform for action. A lot of it, of course, would be nuanced further, because all of those issues are still hold, right? All of those issues hold. But the idea was, as has been, I think Ruth has really brought forth this point very well, that you're not looking at it in verticals or sectors, because one of the things there was a critique of Beijing was that, you put them into sectors. There was women in poverty, women in education, women in health, and is that the way to go about it? In a sector-specific form, yes, because governments work like that, programming takes place like that. But at the end of the day, the gender architecture of institutions should bring all of this in an intersectoral, intersectional analysis, because women's lives are not fragmented and they don't live by schemes. And if they don't live only by schemes from Department of Agriculture and Department of Health and Department of Education, and there's a way by which conversions and meaningful ways of working can evolve. So I think a far more deeper analysis of how local governance measures can be, built, where women can, influence the agenda, be part of setting the agenda, their voices of taking this forward. So to me, those are some of the points that we have to bring these fragments together in a larger whole. Because even in the SDGs, you have 17 goals and so many targets. But at the end of the day, how do you converge? How do you bring it all together? Now we have seen in the context of COVID that there has been one national response all over the world. The government has taken charge. It's given itself a mandate to respond to it, and all ministries and all the peoples and all the programming. It had to be done. It's an emergency. But can it not be done with due diligence across all the other agendas of development? And that's the point that I'd like.
Welcome back, Ruth, where I'm asking if you had to revise the Beijing Platform for Action with the COVID learnings, what would you add or underscore? And let me ask Sanya to speak before we come back to you. So.
Swarnaji, if I take a hard look at our past and project ourselves into the future, that overcomes the shortcomings previously laid unaddressed, to truly build back better, I would honestly say that nothing is irrelevant or secondary. The world ending events defy our priorities at this point of time, and everything becomes important. But if I were to choose, I think for me, care work, both paid and unpaid, that sustains our societies and our economies, but at a high cost to women. That is something that I want to prioritize and underscore, especially now when we are moving into that transitional period, like I said before. That's what I would want to highlight much more strongly.
Thank you, Ruth. And people can also put their questions into chat or prepare to ask them. Mute, you're mute.
I think action-oriented agenda is very important with investment. All issues are, very important. All issues need to be given priority. But I think while we are addressing gender inequality in general, I think gender inequality of the marginalized communities is a priority. If the marginalized communities are addressed, I suppose that gender equality in India will increase.
Thank you. The floor is now open. Technically, we have 1 minute, but there really is no time limit for our discussions. So. I was actually thinking when Suneeta was speaking earlier, one of the quotations that went on posters and t-shirts was women's rights are human rights. And we are in a time when, here we are struggling for 25 years to pull women's rights into the human rights agenda, but the human rights space itself is now, should we say, notional or challenged, shrinking. So this makes it even harder to be talking about something like the platform on a day-to-day basis, I think. But, was just thinking about that when you were talking earlier. If, we can now just come into the conversation. Poril, you want to just unmute, like at your end, unmute people? I think the participants are sort of stunned into silence by everyone's.
Many have left as well.
Yeah, many have left as well. Natasha, welcome back. Unmute yourself and speak.
No, I was here all this while, and I think it was really fabulous presentation by everyone. Loved hearing the context, loved hearing all the points in the successes that you made, and very interesting points on things that, we need to sort of work on. And I wouldn't say criticism, but I'll just say that, future ahead. That's what I would say. But I just had one thing that I've been like observing in reporting and things that I've been reading online, that the constant statement of the government in terms of armed conflict, because I do my research on UNSCR 1225, that there is no armed conflict, so I just feel like I would like to understand what you have to say about intersection of the or like implementation of or sort of going forward in terms of areas where there is AFSPA and armed conflict. How do we move ahead in those areas and like look at issues women are facing, especially in terms of areas with armed conflict or like disturbances, as the government's been saying. And the narrative has been, it's sustained for such a long time. So yeah, it just keeps coming to my mind when I'm reading documents that how is it sustaining for so long?
I can only say that during the planning commission time, I think during the 11th 5-year plan, women in armed conflict and issues of AFSA were part of the agenda. But I don't think it's on the agenda anymore.
was women in disturbed areas, wasn't it?
Yeah, whatever be the formulation.
Yeah,
Yes, I remember that Saita was looking at
yes.
some of these issues, and there was a space to discuss, and these issues were being discussed. But we know that 1325 was not an agenda that our government ever took on. There never was any. There were women's groups met and talked about the Security Council resolution 1680. Many of them, not 1680. I can't remember the subsequent Security Council resolutions, and there are groups working on it. Even UN Women had a working group during Roshni's time. And so groups are working on some of these agendas, but as you know, it's not in the priority.
But I think that groups in Northeast had put up a
the Wings group.
where are we? Yeah, I think the report on General Recommendation 30, Women in Conflict, Prevention, Conflict and Post-Conflict situations. The report in the last CEDAW report was an extensively written report. I think we were wanting, like, at least we could send this copy to you. I think it's a very important. Actually, the women, I would say, in conflicting situation, women are the one who are doing some work. Of course, like there are, as soon as when they find men, they put them in jail. Then they get incarcerated, and one has to work on. The women, with all the difficulties, they are the one who are really forcing the state. Really, they are the one who are forcing the state to bring about peace. And we are saying that we do not want conflict. Conflict is needed by the politics of the region. But I think women want peace. They've exhibited what happens. They're saying that what happens to us at home, in working places, where our children are missing. The recent question related to citizenship. If you really look at it, the government of India thinks who are to be given the citizenship, who should not be given on the basis of religion. I think we see this, and we presented the first CEDAW report to the CEDAW committee, and our government said that we have no conflict in India as prescribed in the international definition of conflicts. So they still think the conflicts in our regions is not conflicts. So we may say internal disturbances, like it happens like on the street, suddenly two sets of group of boys stand there and fight with each other. But I think there are undercurrents. I think women need peace. Women, day out and day in, they are saying that we need peace, and they are saying that the international resolutions, the international, the promises that you made to resolve conflict, the government of India must accept it and resolve the problems. I think they are very, they are saying it very boldly. That is why I said that women need, to be in the forefront and continue to struggle. Nobody can, solve the struggles, by agencies, by government of India or UN. But I think we can use this document in pressurizing many such, so that's why we need not only, not just rhetorics, but action-oriented programs. Recommendations are there. What would be the action-oriented programs by the government, by the civil society? That's why I said also the questions that we raise is not, all women can raise all questions. There are geographical, there are, groups of women can narrate this, much more strongly. I think to me as an activist, a political activist and all that for years, I would say only our struggle would, bring Beijing platform of action into really an agenda that women enjoy gender equality. It's not just a rhetoric. And I think in this whole program, the younger women read this, like, they don't need to learn from us, but, at least, they really understand all this and move ahead and take leadership. Many of us who are in this movement today, they should understand we are not professionally worked on this. When I say professionally, we are not paid. None of us are paid to do this, 25 years of work. But I think the younger persons, should come in and say, yeah, we are willing to work. They should, many of them will say, what would you be the remuneration for it? And there's no remuneration for, people who are in the movements. I think there is, I would expect that the younger people, spend their time, spend their energy, maybe having an, profession on their own to earn their livelihood. But I think in their free times, they should really join in the movements. I think it's happening. There are many younger people are coming. There is green signal. I believe that any kind of conflict will be reduced or will go ahead or take a different forms only by our action.
Thank you. Thank you. I also wanted to add that there are two ways to come at your question, Natasha. One is from the point of view of 1325 and WPS, which is, where we try to say, well, how do we get this thing adopted in these circumstances? But I think from the activist public education point of view, it's actually more useful sometimes to talk about CEDAW and SDG and even the Universal Declaration, which are surprisingly less controversial documents. So they make for an easier entry into exactly the same issues of participation, prevention, protection, and building back better, actually. So, I think about this a lot because as you know, I work on WPS, but I sit in a city which seems to be very far removed from conflict, traditionally defined. It's when you open it up and you look at conflict as structural, intersectional, that then, of course, everything applies. But I preempted Sanya's response. And
aside from all of this, I think what I would find it easier also to look at it from the perspective of, doing advocacy on recommendations that came out of the Justice Verma Committee report in 2013. Because, like you've rightly said, I think these are some of the issues that one is talking about, poverty of education, healthcare, employment, security, access to justice, which are much more evident in some of the conflict-affected parts and regions of India. But I think what the committee report does for us is it gives us a better inroad to push some of these action agendas, and that's probably, so as far as I can assess, I think that's a much more easier and less threatening, document to push your agendas. So I think that's where I would place my bets.
Yeah.
It's very hard to bring this, Natasha, sorry.
No, I'm just saying thank you so much. Over the past few months, since we've gone down into COVID crisis, I've also been thinking that, the challenges that women in these regions face, they amplify so much in terms of COVID crisis, and, how much research are we doing in terms of looking at just these areas? And it's interesting to see, there's not much literature that I've found that focuses on COVID crisis in these regions. Obviously, there's in Northeast, there's a whole lot of work that the community is doing, but in sort of Kashmir, I'm not seeing a lot of initiatives, the little bit that the women are mobilizing themselves in terms of looking at how isolation has impacted women previously so much that now it's even becoming the situation is worsening even more now. So it's that's sort of my concern, and that's what I look at when I look at these things. So, but thank you so much. I have really good points.
On that
Swarna ji,
note, I think
hi. Oh, sorry, just one really
yeah,
quick
sure.
point, but on another note, thank all the panelists for their great insights, but I would just want to
You
quickly
can
add
turn
one
on your
thing.
video.
Uh, okay, no, I'm sitting in a very crowded place. I'm
Okay.
sorry. I'm really sorry. Yeah, so the point that I wanted to make is that, for me, the uniqueness of the Beijing plus 25 process is that for the first time, globally, regionally, and also at the national level, I think commendable efforts are being made to bridge the intergenerational gap. We see a lot of young feminists sort of coming forward, and several intergovernmental agencies, including UN Women, are sort of pushing and driving the generation equality agenda. And, we young feminists are sort of deepening our own intersectional analysis in all our diversities and, varied abilities. And, the panelists have sort of spoken about how gender has sort of evolved, evolved to a spectrum to include the LGBTQI and sexual minorities. And, we're sort of also changing the ways we organize, and of course listening to the great feminists who sort of paved the way for us. But I think we're also doing our bit, and it's really inspiring to see younger feminists sort of facilitating change by really connecting communities, particularly the disabled groups, the LGBTQI communities, to power, knowledge, and resources. And also we're, I think, at a very pivotal moment in history, because as we feminists sort of express solidarity with the African Americans, especially in India, the narrative of discrimination, hate, bigotry, is way too familiar for us. I think as feminists, we've been sort of working towards building social justice movements that sort of frame our structural oppression and systemic violence. And that sort of, with this whole George Floyd murder and the whole Black Lives Matter movement, I think the one thing that has really sort of come out is the need to strengthen our social justice movements with greater force. And I truly believe that the Beijing plus 25 processes, all sorts of process, this year and in 2021, where the Generation Equality Forum is going to happen, I think it will definitely sort of pave the way for, more participatory and accountable processes. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And also, Natasha and me studied together, and we haven't seen each other for 10 years. So I'm seeing her after really long.
She still hasn't seen you today. Thank you very much. First of all, to the three panelists who are incredibly busy people who were very, very generous with their time in preparing and agreeing to come and being here. So I can't thank you enough. And I hope you will keep coming back. I mean, we never, there's never a one-time invitation from Prajnya, so you're warned. We're going to keep calling you again and again. And I hope you will come, and I hope you had a good time.